Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 29, The Saxon Conquest. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, following a request from the Pope, Charles invaded the Lombard kingdom. Unable to defeat the Frankish army, King Desiderius retreated to Pavia to outweight the Franks. However, Charles was determined and maintained a siege through the winter. When Desiderius finally surrendered, he was exiled to a remote monastery, and Charles announced that he was now king of the Franks and king of the Lombards. Returning to his conquest of the Saxons, Charles took a break to intervene in a Muslim civil war in Al-Andalus. However, the intervention was a disaster. Charles had been invited by several rulers in the northeast of the peninsula, but they refused to let his army enter their cities when they realized that Charles intended to make himself at home in the region. Unable to force his way into the cities, Charles returned home, but unleashed his frustration on the Christian Basques, sacking their city Pamplona. Fortunately, Italy remained stable and even improved when Duke Hildebrand of Spoleto traveled north to formally submit to Charles in 779. This submission likely encouraged Charles to visit Italy in the end of 780 and remain there over the winter. Sadly, there are no notes of the meeting between Charles and Hildebrand, but Charles felt secure enough to remain in Italy for months without an army. While the Lombard kingdom was peaceful and Spoleto had submitted, the situation in Benevento was very different. Actually, this is a good opportunity to look at southern Italy. After Charles conquered northern Italy, the southern part of Italy below Rome became a separate geopolitical region. Obviously, Constantinople still dreamed of regaining control of Italy, but its last major attempt to reconquer southern Italy was in 663. The invasion was defeated by the Duchy of Benevento, and the empire was too busy in the east to make another attempt. As the major power in the south, Benevento was free to expand until it held almost all of southern Italy by the middle of the 8th century. Only the region between Gaeta and Naples held out, as well as Lower Calabria and Oranto, basically imperial toeholds. However, Charles' conquest of the Lombard kingdom in 774 completely transformed the situation. While Benevento itself was spared direct conquest, the Lombards were no longer the main power in Italy. They had been replaced by the Frankish kingdom. Arichis' father-in-law had disappeared into relatively gentle captivity somewhere in Frankia, while his brother-in-law had fled to Constantinople in a desperate attempt to gain support to retake his family's kingdom. It really needs to be stressed that this was a decisive event. The Lombards had been unlikely to advance past the Alps into Frankia, but they were powerful in Italy. Suddenly, in the space of a year, the Lombard kingdom had been neutered. While his wife was undoubtedly concerned for her family, the situation actually favored Arichis. The Frankish-controlled Lombard kingdom basically left Benevento alone, so Arichis began to call himself prince. He probably would have preferred king, but that would have led to a direct conflict with Charles. The Lombard king and the dukes had usually jostled for influence in Rome, but that option was off the table with a permanent Frankish presence in northern Italy. Recognizing that Rome was now off limits, Arichis transformed the port of Salerno, a bit south of Naples, into the second major city of his principality. Everything was going well for Prince Arichis, except that his success had attracted the attention of Charles. While Prince was not king, it was closer to king than duke, so Charles found time in his schedule to make a visit to Italy in 781 and explain the correct protocol to Arichis. Actually, 781 would prove to be a pivotal year since Charles negotiated a marriage alliance with Constantinople, where his daughter Rotruda would marry Emperor Constantine VI. The alliance ensured that Arichis of Benevento had no potential allies. To be honest, the marriage alliance had a much larger goal than the isolation of an overly ambitious Lombard duke. Emperor Leo IV had died in 780, succeeded by his 10-year-old son Constantine VI. As regent, Constantine's mother Irene agreed to the marriage alliance between her son and Charles's daughter. Clearly, the Franks were expanding and they were now on the border with the empire, so hopefully the marriage alliance would avoid an inconvenient war on the empire's western border. Aside from the marriage alliance with Constantinople, Charles had decided to appoint his son Pippin to be king of Italy. Wow, so Pippin the Hunchback would become king of Italy? Not exactly. Prior to the coronation, Pope Hadrian baptized Charles's third son, Charlemagne, renaming him Pippin, which was a fine name, the name of his father and numerous ancestors. However, it was a little awkward since he already had a son named Pippin, who was actually his eldest son. Admittedly, he was probably illegitimate, but if you can arrange for a pope to perform a baptism, you could probably arrange for him to be declared legitimate. Unfortunately, Pippin was a hunchback, and Charles apparently did not believe that someone with a physical deformity could rule. So his eldest son kept his name and was treated well, but he was not given any lands to rule. Instead, 13-year-old Pippin had to watch his much younger half-brother receive both his name and the title King of Italy. It was kind of Pope Hadrian to personally baptize Charlemagne. Well, he probably was happy to perform the ceremony since he would finally receive some of the lands he wanted. It is a bit unclear since the original texts did not survive, but the two separate grants of land were later confirmed by Charles's successor Louis the Pious. The first block was granted in 781 and the second block was granted in 787. The first block of land gave the papacy territory located around the city of Rome, basically expanding the papacy. Actually, the coronation of Pippin, formerly known as Charlemagne as King of Italy, was part of a larger policy to integrate the more recently acquired territories into Greater Frankia. The sons were sent to the border regions to be raised there so they would grow up immersed in local customs and thus hopefully not be considered foreign occupiers by the locals. Charles, the eldest legitimate son, was kept at court to watch him rule, while the next two eldest sons were assigned territories to rule, guided by trusted advisors. Pippin lived in Italy, and Louis became king of Aquitaine, which became a sub-kingdom in 781. It is interesting that the two remote regions that had little connection to Frankia were formally acknowledged as separate kingdoms. The following year, Charles decided to celebrate a victory in Saxony. Charles's predecessors had been limited by wars on several fronts, but he had ended the Lombard threat and could focus his attention on the Saxons. Although it was never discussed out loud, Charles had become harder after the defeat at Roncesvalles, so the annual campaigns against the Saxons were driven by religious fanaticism. Unlike Lombardy, where he had won a decisive victory, the Saxon War was an endless series of campaigns, a war of attrition where he gradually extended his borders. Employing a systematic approach, Charles built fortresses in newly conquered territory at the end of each campaign, staffing them with large garrisons and numerous priests, who would try to convert the Saxons. The conversion process was simple: accept baptism or die. While the Saxons lost steadily, the war was not one-sided and thousands of Frankish soldiers died. Charles's annual campaigns against the Saxons were basically a never-ending series of sieges and patrols against guerrillas. The Saxons quickly realized that they could not face the Frankish army in open battle, so they fought a war of ambushes. The Franks quickly realized that they could not simply march in, defeat a Saxon army, and receive regular tribute. So the Franks cleared areas in the forests, built fortresses, sent supplies to the garrisons by river and along narrow roads, while the Saxons tried to starve out the garrisons by ambushing patrols and supply convoys. Despite the horrendous cost, Charles would not give up since he had staked his prestige on the war. Finally, by 782, Charles felt that he had established his control over the Saxons, so he held an assembly in Saxon territory that summer. Aside from Saxon chiefs and the nobles of Frankia and Italy, there were even emissaries from the Danes and the Avars who were neighbors. Shortly after the assembly ended, Charles announced that the conquered land would be divided into ecclesiastical units. Churches in Saxony would be subsidized by 10% of all fines imposed in the area and 10% of the residents' movable wealth and income. Basically, the Saxons would be taxed heavily to finance their religious subjugation. The combination of heavy taxes and religious tyranny sparked a massive revolt in 783 that resulted in the destruction of a powerful Frankish army. When bad weather made it difficult to campaign in 784, Charles left his son, Charles the Younger, in command of part of the army in Westphalia, and then led the rest of the army through Thuringia to invade Saxony from a different direction. He then marched along the Elbe River, burning everything he found throughout the winter. The survivors fled further north, but it was winter and they must have starved. Even so, the Saxons continued to resist, and many churches were burned, but Charles refused to leave Saxony to the Saxons. Gathering a massive army, he relentlessly pursued King Widukind until most of the Saxons had been trapped. Then he had his revenge. 4,500 Saxons were executed over the course of a long day. Possibly the chronicler inflated the number to glorify the scale of the Saxon defeat, but he did not invent the mass execution. Although he portrayed himself as a Christian avenger, Pope Hadrian refused to condone the massacre. Aside from the mass executions, Charles carried out ethnic cleansing. 10,000 Saxons were resettled in distant parts of the Frankish kingdom, and the campaigns became brutal subjugation from that point on. Aside from military repression, Charles introduced a new approach when he announced the First Saxon Capitulary, a series of laws that legalized the forced conversion of the Saxons. Uninterested in nuance or complexity, the laws were clear and left no room for interpretation. Murdering priests, looting churches, refusing baptism, continuing pagan practices, and even eating meat during Lent all shared a single punishment: death. While the mass execution had ended large-scale resistance, Charles was unable to achieve lasting peace regardless of his methods. He rewarded any Saxon leaders who agreed to follow him, and he tried to give Saxon warriors an outlet for their anger by hiring Saxon cohorts and sending them to serve in campaigns in other parts of the kingdom. But still, Saxon resistance continued. Realizing that he would never have victory while Widukind lived, Charles sent hostages as goodwill and convinced the Saxon leader to negotiate, finally persuading him to surrender and accept baptism in exchange for rich presents and high office. When Charles finally made peace with Widukind, it was actually a gamble, since the residents of the region of Frankia near Saxony had suffered Saxon raids for a decade and wanted revenge, as did the families of the soldiers and the nobles killed when a Frankish army was destroyed in 783. In the end, the peace held, and Saxony became part of the kingdom. Charles had conquered Saxony, but he also transformed it. Obviously, he destroyed the native pagan worship, but the Saxon nobles who bent the knee were rewarded with landowning rights over their free neighbors, following the Frankish tradition, which created a new aristocracy. Meanwhile, in Italy, aware that he could not expand north, Arichis tried to expand his territory south, but he failed to defeat Naples. Still, he remained independent, mainly because Charles was busy eradicating the Saxons. However, the subjugation of the Saxons had been completed by 786, so Charles decided to end the marriage alliance with Constantinople. Honestly, it was obvious after 6 years that it would never happen, so Charles met the Greek envoys at Capua in 787 and informed them that he would not send his daughter to Constantinople to marry the young emperor. Wait, Capua was part of Benevento. Had he improved relations with Arichis? Not really. Arichis had fled when Charles and his army entered the duchy. Once he was safe and far away, Arichis sent messengers with his submission. Charles may not have viewed the submissions as genuine, but the threat of malaria was genuine, so he accepted the submission and returned to Rome along with Arichis's younger son Grimoald as hostage. Arichis had also promised to return some land to the Papal Republic, but unsurprisingly changed his mind once the Frankish army had left. So the situation in southern Italy had been resolved. Not exactly. Rather than return home with bad news, the imperial envoys decided to make an alliance to replace the now ended relationship with Charles. Recognizing that Arichis was the only option, they offered him the position of patrician, higher than duke, and he unsurprisingly accepted. Backed by the empire, Arichis had become a threat to the Frankish kingdom, but he died on August 26, 787. There was no obvious successor since his older son, Romuald, had died a month earlier, and his other son, Grimoald, was a hostage with the Franks. Arichis' widow Adelchis was a daughter of Desiderius and had little interest in submission to the Franks, who had deposed her father and thrown him into a monastery. Still, as a widow whose surviving son was a hostage, her influence was limited, and she likely would have been invaded by one of her neighbors. However, it turned out that help was on the way. The empire saw an opportunity and sent an invasion force led by Desiderius' son Adelchis to occupy Benevento. He had fled to Constantinople when Charles had conquered the Lombard kingdom over a decade earlier. The empire had kept him fed and relatively happy, viewing the costs of his meals and accommodation as an investment in case he proved useful. Well, he suddenly proved useful. Since another army was sent against Ravenna, the empire was making a major effort to regain dominance in Italy, and an alliance with Benevento would greatly improve their chances of success. However, Adelchis realized that her brother would simply be an imperial puppet and convinced Charles to release her son Grimoald, who would not be an imperial puppet. Ignoring Hadrian's protests, Charles released Grimoald after he swore fealty. Grimoald returned to Benevento and allied with his fellow Lombard Hildebrand of Spoleto to defeat the imperial army in 788. Grimoald's opposition to his uncle Adelchis was probably based on the realization that the empire was the greater threat, since it intended to actually rule southern Italy, while Charles simply wanted to maintain control of northern Italy and to prevent attacks on Rome. Once the empire had been defeated, Grimoald resumed the autonomy of Benevento. Charles's strategy had worked. The empire had failed to regain its territory in Italy, but Grimoald did not openly defy Charles. However, Grimoald refused to return any land to the Papal Republic, which undoubtedly made Hadrian furious. That fury was undoubtedly expressed to Charles, politely of course, but he had little interest in the massive cost of a campaign in southern Italy to discipline an autonomous duchy that did not directly threaten him or his papal ally, and had directly resisted the only real rival to the Franks, the Eastern Empire. In the end, the Papal Republic survived as an independent entity, but Benevento, Spoleto, Venice, and Ravenna also maintained their independence. At the same time, the surviving Lombard duchies proved unable to combine to restore a Lombard monarchy that could retake control of most of Italy. To sum up, the Frankish kingdom had expanded close to the border of what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire. Since the Franks had not stopped expanding, conflict seemed likely until King Charles and Empress Irene negotiated a marriage alliance between their children. Recognizing that the former Lombard kingdom and Aquitaine needed time to adapt to Frankish control, Charles appointed his two youngest sons sub-kings of the two regions, giving them more autonomy. Once the border regions had been resolved, Charles could focus his energy on the subjugation of the Saxons. Fighting was fierce, but the last major resistance ended when the Saxon leader Widukind bent the knee. When the empire tried to place Desiderius' son Adelchis on the throne of Benevento after Arichis died suddenly, Charles backed Arichis' son Grimoald because he would not be an imperial puppet. Since Saxony and Italy were stable, Charles could only expand east, which I will discuss next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.